Right? This is the same political party that did not want to accept that President Obama was actually an American. It's the same Republican right-wing extremism that stormed the Capitol. It's the same right-wing extremism that refuses to accept the results of the Civil War. It's raggedy, it's disrespectful, it's mean-spirited, it's an unclean spirit, quite frankly.
This is just one small glimpse at a completely avoidable humanitarian disaster, wrought not by big bad Republicans in the House, but by an administration that refuses to enforce our immigration laws and has flung the door wide open at our southern border.
So, Mayor Brandon Johnson using some pretty heated rhetoric there for those calling to close the border. And a Republican congressman saying that it's not the issue of Republicans wanting lawful border control, but it's the issue of the border being wide open. Welcome back. I'm Greg Bishop. Thanks for hanging out. Like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. Buy some merch if you are interested, and get some coffee cups and some hoodies and whatever. So I appreciate your guys' support as we continue to grow. But yesterday, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson, he held a news conference with faith leaders out of Chicago as the city has seen dozens of buses over the weekend, more than 24,000 non-citizens coming to Chicago from the southern U.S. border after crossing the border. Governor Pritzker says, hey, they are asylum seekers and they are here legally. Well, they're here kind of on an interim legal basis, I guess. They still have to go through the asylum process. That requires getting an attorney and filing paperwork and such. But Mayor Johnson talking about getting these non-citizens some kind of housing, which is costing taxpayers tens of millions of dollars. And it's not just the cost for housing, it's the cost for food and healthcare and education as well. So these are obviously growing concerns for a humanitarian issue, but also growing concerns for the taxpayers in the state of Illinois. And we've seen the efforts of trying to have city buses in Chicago be warming stations. We've seen the flood of individuals in police station lobbies and sleeping in tents outside of police stations. We've seen the protests from people in Chicago saying that they have had enough and they are not willing to be pushed off to the side for the resources that they need for their community while they see those resources going to non-citizens. And the questions about sanctuary state and sanctuary city policies and how that may be driving this ongoing crisis. But really, the crux of it comes down to the question of the border. Why is the border not being secured? Why have we seen upwards to 2, maybe 3 million individuals come across the border in just a handful of years under the Biden administration, dwarfing what was coming across the border during the Trump administration? Obviously, the Biden administration is handling border security in a different way, seeming to let people just walk right on through instead of turning them around at the border or going about and deporting people here illegally. You have seen some efforts to deport Venezuelans who are here past the, I think, July 31st dates that the Department of Homeland Security has given temporary protected status to Venezuelans. But you've also got reports out there of continued crime being committed by some nefarious actors who are here as non-citizens. And all these non-citizens, are they really here legitimately seeking asylum, or are they using that asylum privilege to get into the country to maybe commit some crimes? So obviously the question of border security is still very much top of mind. Mayor Johnson yesterday talking about bringing the faith community in to provide more assistance. He was asked about, well, should we just go ahead and seal up the border? Should that be something? Republicans are pushing for that to be paramount, to seal the border, to close the border. And Johnson, he used some fiery rhetoric to go after the opposing party from the Democrats.
Well, it has to be better coordination. What we've seen is a very raggedy form instituted by right-wing extremism. Everyone knows that the right-wing extremism in this country has targeted democratically ran cities. And quite frankly, they've been very intentional about going after democratically ran cities that are led by people of color. And their whole motivation is to create disruption and chaos, because that's what that particular party has been about. Right? This is the same political party that did not want to accept that President Obama was actually an American. It's the same Republican right-wing extremism that stormed the Capitol. It's the same right-wing extremism that refuses to accept the results of the Civil War. It's raggedy, it's disrespectful, it's mean-spirited, it's an unclean spirit, quite frankly. And so I got you. I just want to make sure that people understand what we're facing. That's why it's so important that the faith community is leaning in this moment. And so what I've said, there has to be better coordination.
So Johnson went on to talk about a variety of examples of the faith community stepping up to help out. But you heard there he talked about the unclean spirits of those who are pushing for border control, to close the border of those crossing to either, legitimately claim asylum or to use that in an untruthful manner. But here's more of what Johnson had to say yesterday.
It is abysmal, and it's an affront for everything that is good about this country, for the extremism in this country to use people as political tools to settle political scores for something that happened 400 years ago. They're still mad that a black man is free in this country. This is nothing new, but aren't you glad that the soul of Chicago won't be broken? And those are the words of, I think, Beyonce, "You won't break our soul."
So I don't know if we can get through a Johnson news conference without him quoting Beyonce to some degree. Regardless, he was eventually later on asked about, closing the border, and should that be part of this equation? And especially when you've got 25 buses that arrived in Chicago over the holiday weekend.
Oh, that's a good question. First of all, the control that we have in the city is doing what we're doing now. Yeah, I don't have control over what they're doing at the border. That would require me to be the president of the United States of America. Don't get too excited. So because we can't control the flow, I have to build up and prepare, regardless of what it looks like today. Because quite frankly, I believe it was between January and April of this year, 0 buses came, and there was very little preparation. We're not going to succumb to that element, right? We're going to continue to prepare. And as far as the churches, these are churches that are prepared to embrace them because that's what they've been doing.
And again, the news conference yesterday was more about the faith community and philanthropists coming together in Chicago to help provide some housing, as the state also is stepping up with tens of millions of dollars. We'll touch on that in a moment. But the fiery rhetoric that Democrats are using, saying it's MAGA extremist, unclean, spirited, racist Republicans who aren't willing to address this issue properly. Republicans are saying that's not that. It's really the problem being a porous border. While the news conference was happening over in Chicago and Washington, D.C., you had a U.S. House hearing, a rules hearing in the U.S. House about there was a variety of different measures they were talking about, but one in particular that I tuned into briefly and just happened to catch was a law that they're hoping to pass to restrict the federal government's use of public parks to house migrants. And apparently that's something that has been happening, and U.S. House Republicans want to restrict the Biden administration's ability to use public lands in this fashion to house non-citizen arrivals. New York Representative Langworthy, he talked a bit about this and really went after the idea that it's the big bad Republicans, he says, that are trying to make this problem worse and dividing the country over this issue.
See the footage of what's happening in America's cities, and they see the footage at the border, and they just scratch their head as to why isn't the administration doing the obvious, which is just shutting down the border. But thank you very much, Chairman. I appreciate you reiterating these points for us today, because we cannot just act like this is an inevitable and unavoidable flood of illegal migration when we know for a fact that it's this administration and the sanctuary policies of Governor Kathy Hochul in New York and Mayor Adams in New York City. They are directly responsible for the mess that New Yorkers, like my own constituents, New York State taxpayers, are stuck to deal with. And I'd like to also address the repeated claims by colleagues on the other side of the aisle that this legislation is cruel or callous or inhumane or whatever other adjective that they'd like to use. To quote a recent article on the encampment of illegal migrants at Floyd Bennett Field, it was reported that, quote, Parents say they swaddle their children in bed sheets but can't stop them from shivering through the night as they tried to fall asleep in tents. This is just one small glimpse at a completely avoidable humanitarian disaster, wrought not by big bad Republicans in the House, but by an administration that refuses to enforce our immigration laws and has flung the door wide open at our southern border. Children should not be shivering in the night at Floyd Bennett Field in New York City, and they wouldn't be if this administration and Democrats in New York and other so-called sanctuary states and cities would acknowledge the true harm and destruction that their policies have brought on Americans and immigrants alike.
And again, that's the porous southern U.S. border being the issue that Republicans raise as the main reason why we're dealing with this. And cities complaining about getting these influx of non-citizens. They're sanctuary cities. And they've set up policies that say, hey, you're welcome here, regardless of your immigration status. It's not an effort to say you're welcome here only for those who are seeking asylum. It's you're welcome here regardless of your immigration status. But again, all of this comes with not just the humanitarian toll with winter. It's pretty cold out there, guys. And sleeping in a tent in the street of Chicago doesn't sound very humanitarian, but that's kind of where we're at, right? I mean, warming buses, military base camp tents, and temporary shelter for the tens of thousands that have arrived. More are on the way. Obviously, a lot of costs associated with that as well, not just the humanitarian toll, but the taxpayer cost. Governor J.B. Pritzker yesterday was asked about the transparency issues around taxpayer spending on this. If you recall, about 11 days ago, he announced $160 million additional dollars going to be used for a variety of services for non-citizens, from wraparound services to housing and such. Yesterday, he talked about, well, that's apparently going to have to bring about some kind of supplemental spending authority that state legislators are going to have to bring about.
We've put it out. I think what we're trying to do is use all the line items that are necessary at the Department of Human Services in order to fulfill the needs in this humanitarian crisis. People, if you want to nitpick about what's happening, also ask yourself, if you want us to delay, then the 15 degrees is going to have a bigger impact on these families because they're all going to be outside for a lot longer than you'd like. So I want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can. Obviously, those are going to be parts of a budget discussion with the General Assembly. We have made it available to the General Assembly to vote on if they wanted to have a supplemental in order to provide dollars for this, or to do it during the veto session, or in the regular session during January to May. It'd be great if we could end in March, but January to May, and so those are decisions that the General Assembly will make with us going forward.
So obviously, indication is we're going to see more taxpayer spending. We've already spent hundreds of millions. You've got the healthcare costs that have been budgeted for $550 million, but it's projected to cost $830 million, I believe, plus the tens of millions for housing. And the costs just keep stacking up. If you recall, we talked with State Representative Brad Halbrook about a week and a half ago or so, and he addressed how they're seeing it's going to be more than $700 million, if not close to $1 billion of extra spending on top of what taxpayers are already spending. And that's a lot of funds, a lot of money that should be going towards, I don't know, like pensions or other social services that taxpayers demand. Here's State Representative Brad Halbrook talking about the costs and how it's just getting to a tipping point.
It appears that in the BIMP bill, right, the budget implementation plan that was passed in May, the governor has always had authority to move budgets or numbers around up to 4%. But in this BIMP bill, I don't know if anybody knows this yet, but it allows the governor to double the amount of money that he can move, 8% that he can move on line item to line item. And I think that's just staggering. Okay. So I think that's troubling. I mean, when you take a almost $51 billion and say the governor now can move up to 8% of that, is that like 4.5? Let me back up. If it's nearly a $51 billion budget, and if the governor can move around nearly 8% of that, that's $4.5 billion, I believe.
It's a lot of money, no question about it. State Representative Brad Halbrook with us here with Bishop on Air, talking about the latest in funding for the migrant issue. Do you think that the cost controls the governor talked about before the start of the fiscal year, the co-pays for undocumented migrants getting subsidized health care coverage, the ability to cut off some of the new enrollees for the subsidies over those age 65 and older, are those going to amount to really anything?
Well, I don't really know the answer to that one yet, and I guess that one yet remains to be seen. But I think something that is worth noting that in the governor's own management and budget office last week, they rolled out the fact that there's going to be $1 billion+ of additional pressures on this current fiscal year, and that they'll probably be seeking a supplemental appropriation come this spring. So I don't know how this is all going to play out in the final analysis. But it looks like the governor's on a spending spree. He's allowed to move double the amount of money than anybody in the previous history. And so this is just going to put more and more pressure on taxpayers. Now, they'll argue the point that revenues are increasing, but at some point in time, there's a tipping point here.
And that tipping point, obviously something that is concerning for a lot of people. All right. It is Bishop on Air. Thanks for hanging out. We've got a few more segments, but if you follow along live, you can obviously catch up on things later on as we segment out these videos. So be sure to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell here on YouTube. You can watch it live on Facebook and on X, formerly known as Twitter. So I appreciate all the supports, and be sure to visit the store at bishoponair.com if you want to further support the show. So I appreciate everybody tuning in. We'll be watching all of these issues and